Hi, everyone. We have a real treat today. We have Dr. Sean McDowell with us, and I'm here with Joel Rodriguez. He partners with me sometimes in interviewing some of these great apologists and great authors and people out there. And so today we have the great honor of having Dr. Sean McDowell, who is a professor over at Biola. He is an expert in a lot of Christian topics, and he's written a whole bunch of books. And so the latest one that I just finished reading a couple days ago is The Fate of the Apostles. And so we're going to discuss that today and whether this martyrdom really occurred. People have said there's these martyrdoms, and what probabilities do we have based on the evidence that's out there, both inside and outside of the Bible. And so I also wanted to say that Dr. Sean McDowell has published a bunch of things. So you guys are also going to want to pick up what's sitting right in front of me, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. You're going to want to go look at some of his other books. I understand there's a whole bunch of them. Read his dad's stuff. His dad, Josh McDowell, has written books like More Than a Carpenter, and he wrote a book on the book of Daniel that I found a while ago when I was trying to investigate Daniel. And so he's got some great stuff out there. You guys are definitely going to want to go into the links. If I haven't linked the books, I think I have, but if I haven't, I'm going to go link those into the description so you can pick them up. And so I'm going to turn it over to Dr. McDowell just to introduce himself.
Oh, gosh, thanks for having me on. Sorry for being a couple minutes late, but this is a treat to finally connect. I see the work that you're doing is great as well. First off, I've been married 20 years to my high school sweetheart, really 21 years now. And we got 3 kids, teach Biola, Talbot School of Theology full-time, get to write, do a ton of social media stuff. I really just love communicating ideas, and then actually teach one class, high school class, part-time 3 mornings a week, because my heart is really the next generation.
Yeah, that's great. And you also pretend you're an atheist sometimes.
You know, I've been doing that for years, but I was at a Christian school probably 4-6 weeks ago, and the Bible teacher says, he goes, I think some students might recognize you, but I think a lot won't. I want to tell them you're an atheist. I was like, okay. Well, we did the whole video and they posted on their website. And last I checked, it was like almost 700,000 views. It just went viral. So yeah, they can see it there. Or I actually put it on my YouTube channel too, but it's the single best teaching strategy I know with students. Normally, I know I'm a Christian role playing, and it just forces people to think and wrestle with ideas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just going to ask you something. What made you get into apologetics and all of that stuff? And also, who influenced you into getting into apologetics?
I'd say a few things influenced me to get into it. Number one is just having a dad who's an apologist. I never once remember him saying, son, you should be an apologist. You should write books. It was that he just loved what he did. And I saw him influence people's lives. I saw him pour his heart into this. We would have conversations about these things, and believe it or not, my dad would ask a lot more questions and challenge me to think than he'd sit me down and say, here's 5 reasons to believe in the resurrection. He just trained me to love and seek truth in the idea of the mind. So that's one reason. Second, I went through a pretty significant doubt period when I was about 19 years old. And I really needed to know, do I believe this? Does this make sense? Am I just believing what my parents tell me? And then having a heart for young people. I'm wearing a Captain America Black Panther shirt. I just love hanging out with students. And I started to realize they have real questions if I want to work with this generation. There, at that time, a couple decades ago, there were not a lot of good communicators with apologetics to students. I mean, you could count them on your hand. It's grown a ton. But that's the reason I got into apologetics. The people that have influenced me, again, I mean, obviously my father, but some of the big people would be like William Lane Craig, J.P. Moreland. Greg Koukl had a huge influence on me as far as just my tactical approach. Those are some of the 3. I love the writings of Nancy Pearcey for years, have followed her. And then even some church fathers that I've read over years, people like Augustine and, more recently C.S. Lewis as well.
Yeah, you really do a phenomenal job in both debates, and actually even as playing an atheist. I tried to play an atheist once, and I just sat there straw manning them, and I thought, I'm an awful atheist. But you actually were quite convincing to the point where I was starting to get mad at you.
Well, you know what? It takes time to do that. I mean, I've done this for years in the classroom and at events, but every time I'm reading an atheist, I'm always thinking, what are their best arguments? I don't want to set up a straw man of atheism. I finished one time, and this guy went walking down the middle fast. He goes, hey, that was a really good atheist role play. He goes, you defended atheism better than I could. And I'm an atheist. And I thought, well, That's actually good. I do nobody a service if I set up a straw man, but it's taken me a long time to get there. And believe it or not, it's actually confirmed me that much more in my own faith by trying to sympathetically understand atheism.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say to those people who say, hey, I'm a good Christian, believe the Bible, and I have no need for apologetics. I don't want to be convincing anybody. I'm good the way I am.
I guess I would say two things. I'd say, number one, Scripture doesn't say it's okay to be good with where you're at and not be ready with an answer. Apologetics is not just for Bible teachers and YouTubers like us. Peter distinctly says to the church spread out in the area at the time in 1 Peter, he's like, sanctify Christ as Lord in your heart, always be ready with an answer. It's not a spiritual gift. It's for all believers. Second, if you don't learn at least, I'm not saying everyone needs to be a professional apologist, but if you don't grow in this area in your life, I'm going to say you are letting down the young people in your life because they do have questions. And it's your job as a parent, as a grandparent, as an adult in the church, even if you're single, to be available and engage in this generation to help them navigate their faith in a culture because they are bombarded with these questions.
But do you think there is a danger in focusing too much on apologetics and then neglecting other areas like spiritual growth and whatnot?
Joel, there's a danger in focusing too much on anything. This is not unique to apologists. Now, do apologists tend to fall in that trap more than others? Yeah, that's true. So I would say it's just a fair warning that those who love the life of the mind should remember and make sure they bring balance. But that kind of balance and warning we all need, regardless of whether we tend to love apologetics or not.
Yeah, I want to get into your book here. And so I just wanted to say, one of the things that I admire about this book is you take a very skeptical approach and you don't jump into what some apologists, and myself, I'm included in this group. I tend to just believe stuff more on face value sometimes before doing a deep dive into the evidence. And so you went in here and you said, I'm not just going to automatically assume that Peter was crucified upside down or Paul was beheaded. I'm going to go look at all the evidence. And then you form these categories where it could be where it's the highest probability, the highest possible probability, very probably true. You had a number of different categories, and then you ranked all of these early apostles on those categories. And I thought that was a really interesting approach. And so I just wanted to say, which ones can we be the most confident in? And what did you do to come up with what was the confidence levels, the highest probabilities?
I've got to give huge props to Mike Lacona, who read my dissertation and was one mentor through this process. In terms of, he said to me many times when I was trying to assess an apostle, he'd say, take a step back and ask yourself, would a Muslim buy the evidence? I thought, wow, that's a good way, because there were sometimes I found myself wanting these stories to be true and had to keep checking myself saying, no, wait a minute, where does the evidence point? So coming up with that criteria, that rubric, that took me hours and hours and hours alone with conversations with people like Tim McGrew. But once you have a formula and a methodology, then you just start plugging in the different apostles to it based upon the quantity and quality of the evidence. So I included the 12 apostles and then added Paul and James, the brother of Jesus, who weren't part of the 12, but there's good reason to believe that they were eyewitnesses and they're influential in the church. So I could have added Luke, could have added Mark. You have to stop somewhere. But I picked those 14. So of those 14, I think there's 4 that we have a high probability, historically speaking, died as martyrs. I think there's 2 that you can make a case are at least minimally more plausible than not. And I think the remaining 8, if I did my math right, 8 is we don't really know when history ends and when legend begins. I just think that's where the data points to.
Yeah, and you also went within a window of time. So you wanted to find, you weren't going out into the 4th and 5th and 6th centuries, or after that, you tried to be in the living period of time, I believe.
I tried to. So the living memory is really towards the end of the 2nd century, about 3 generations removed. The point was not that everything within the living memory is accurate and everything outside of it is not, but put a higher emphasis on that window than 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries. Because you really see in the 3rd and 4th centuries, in particular the 4th century, complete just legend emerge, not even tethered to history at all in some cases.
And also, I want to ask you, because everyone has probably different definitions on this, how would you define the word martyrdom?
This is a really interesting question. And I thought when I went into this, I just look up a definition and write it down. But there's extensive, what you might call martyrological debates within the literature of who qualifies as a martyr. So do you have to actually die to be a martyr? What if you're put through the process of a martyr and then you barely hang on to your life? What if you die like 6 months later with an infection you got from somebody who wounded you? Like, all these questions are running through my mind. So I'd have to pull out my book. I think you have it right there and see exactly how I define it, funny enough. But I think it's somebody who's ultimately there has to be a death for somebody to qualify as a martyr tied to their convictions. Those are really the two components. Is it tied in some fashion to my religious faith? And does it ultimately cost me my life? Those are the two main factors, although we could quibble over some of the edges of them.
Yeah, I'm saying because in this is my personal belief and understanding, I think that the Apostle John probably died of natural causes. So he wouldn't qualify in my book as a martyr, even though he believed what he was preaching.
Sure. Well, I agree with that. I think that's right. Now, there are quite a few scholars that think John died as a martyr. This surprised me. I'm not convinced by the evidence, but you see these stories emerge about John drinking poison and surviving, being thrown into boiling water and surviving. I think that's because of the stories like in Matthew 10, where Jesus says to James and John, "You will drink the cup that I will drink and be baptized with my baptism." Many take that as an indication of martyrdom. Well, James dies in Acts 12. What about John? I think it might be some early church fathers' way of saying he went through martyrdom, even though he didn't actually die. I can't prove that, but that's my suspicion.
Or it could probably be that it has been embellished to a certain point, just to show, oh, look, this is true because this happened. Again, when we do history, I'm trying to be reasonably skeptical with the evidence.
Good. Let me ask you this on Candida Moss, because she wrote a book, and a lot of you have some refutations about her in the beginning of your book, and so she has some ideas that she says Candida Moss completely dismisses the evidence for the deaths of the apostles because, quote, "our sources for those events are the stuff of legend, not history." And so you went through a lot of the history to refute that.
Yeah, she was looking at certain what are called like Acts of Peter, these late 2nd, 3rd, 4th, sometimes 5th century documents that are legend filled. And I would say two things. I'd say number one, yes, there's a lot of legends in those, but I think there's still a historical core that cannot be dismissed for some of them. But then second, there's evidence completely outside of those documents in early church fathers, in the case of James, in Josephus, in Gnostic writings, that cannot be dismissed as purely legendary as well. So I think that was too quick of a dismissal on her part.
Yeah, and speaking of that, watching some of your debates, I saw that two of your opponents, they were having trouble because you kept bringing the books of the Bible, and you were using that as a defense, like look at Mark, look at Matthew, and they were saying, no, but wait, you shouldn't be quoting the Bible to prove the Bible. What would you say to those people who say, hey, Matthew cannot validate Luke because they are in the same book, i.e. the Bible?
So the question of the reliability of Matthew and the authorship is a different question from Matthew dying as a martyr for his faith. Mm-hmm. I don't think we know exactly what happened to Matthew. I think the evidence is too late, and in some cases possibly even contradictory. But there's two biblical references that directly cite a death of an apostle. Acts 12, that we have for James, the brother of Jesus. And then in John 20, we have the death of Peter that's predicted by Jesus. Now, there's hints in Paul's writings, and there's hints in Luke about the death of Paul, but they're more indirect than direct. So I just pushed back on them. I said, look, you can't start with a biblical source, Acts, and say I'm dismissing it because it's in the Bible, any more than you could look at a Roman source and say I'm dismissing it if it deals with the Roman because it's Roman. That's just not how history is done. Exactly. Let's look at sources and assess their authorship. Let's assess internal evidence. Let's see if there's archaeological support, corroboration. And when you do that, especially with Acts, there's very good reason to believe it's a historical book. And that passage in Acts 12, like Craig Keener points out in his multi-volume series on Acts, he goes, it just reads like a straightforward execution account. It's not flowered with any legendary document, which tells me that's likely a reliable source.
Yeah, that's with the James, the son of Zebedee, and also Stephen too, right? So
yes, it does have Stephen. I didn't include Stephen in my account, but it did Stephen in a few chapters earlier. That's correct.
Yeah, very good. I mean, that's just interesting stuff. I'm wondering, I want to ask you about your dating perceptions of the book of Acts, because I look at somebody like J. Warner Wallace, and he says that he thinks the book of Acts was written pretty early because it doesn't include the martyrdoms of Peter and Paul, who are the main characters. So he feels maybe it was written before that. But what do you feel about that?
You know, J. Warner Wallace and I have actually debated this. I think he makes, not like publicly, we just have these conversations. I think he's a little bit more confident in that dating methodology than I am. He might be right. When I updated More Than a Carpenter with my dad in 2009, that's the dating that we put forth. But when I really probed into Acts, it is an argument from silence when it's all said and done. Mm-hmm. And I can think of some other reasonable explanations for why they wouldn't include these deaths, such as part of the book of Acts is actually trying to show that Christianity is not totally in opposition to Rome. That seems to be a piece of the book of Acts. Maybe Luke was going to write a third volume. I mean, we don't know. So Keener, I forget the example, but in Keener's commentary in Acts, he gives some examples of other texts that are written later that also don't include comparable type events you would expect them to include within antiquity. So Jay Warner might be right. I'm just a little less sanguine on it than he is.
Yeah, my only thing with that is it just to me doesn't make sense. Why would you spend all of this time writing about, let's say, Stephen and how he died? Someone that, if you compare that person to Paul, has, I think, less significance maybe. Or maybe at the time he had more significance, that can be debated. And not talk about Paul. I understand Keener's argument. I just don't.
So let me jump back. Remember, what's the purpose of Acts? Acts 1:8, that they're going to spread the gospel to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth. So characters are only included in Acts insofar as they advance the narrative to get the gospel to the ends of the earth. You could make a case that that's Rome. So if Paul takes it to Rome and he ends up there, hasn't the larger purpose of Acts been accomplished?
Yeah, very good. Mm-hmm. Joel, do you want to push back a little more, Joel, or you want to?
I mean, look, we don't have to end on this. Smart people go back and forth on this one, and it's fine.
All I'm saying is, to me, it doesn't make sense. You would be spending a lot of time on someone of less significance and not on Paul, because this would be huge. I mean, you should actually show. But again, I understand that. I'm assuming that Luke only wrote Luke and Acts. Maybe there was a second part, third part of the book of Acts that we know nothing about, and maybe in the second or third part he actually talks about Paul. Again, I'm speculating.
Yeah.
But based on the available evidence, I think it does not make sense that Luke is not going to even mention something like that.
So look, so let me jump in just for fun. That's fair, but remember, you could also ask the question, why do we have multiple chapters on Philip the evangelist, who's not even one of the 12? So much so in my research that some people say this makes no sense. He's not a key character. Maybe this really is Philip, one of the 12. Well, why do they do that? Because the writer of Acts is not saying who's the most important writers and do I focus on their story. He only includes characters in Acts that advance the story of the gospel getting to Rome. So that would be that would be my 2 cents. But
let me build on that. Let me just build on that for a second, because I'm thinking of Philip, like you mentioned, and there's this idea where whenever we have a character whose name is repeated, another person shares that same name, like Philip the evangelist versus Philip the apostle, or you've mentioned James, the brother of Jesus, the other one who's the son of Alphaeus, and then there's the one who's the brother of John. So we've got all these names, and we've got the qualifiers. And I was just wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit more about Philip and how he could be different from that as an evangelist from the apostle.
This was one of the hardest things in my research, is that I started to realize that the early church fathers frequently conflated and confused the different, for example, Matthew with Matthias, the different James, and the different Philips. So because of that, I'm reading this going, wait a minute, he's talking about Philip the apostle, but he's referencing the tradition in Acts about what happens to Philip, and they tend to get him confused. So that's why when it came to Philip, there's obviously traditions, if I remember top of my head, into the 3rd and 4th centuries, but they're just not early enough. They're not consistent enough for me to have any confident conclusion what really happened to the apostle.
Do you want to do one of your questions, Joel?
Oh, yes. I just want to ask you this question because we're talking about all of this historical stuff. What do you think about the historical quest of the historical Jesus? Because this is my problem, and I went to seminary, and I remember reading a lot of books on this. My problem is that every time I read anything about the historical Jesus looks like the person who writes or does the quest. Like if that person is a Marxist, Jesus ends up being a socialist or a Marxist or a vegan or something like that.
Sure.
And we don't have like I've seen, for example, Robert Price. He says, well, every time Jesus comes up with a miracle, just strip away the miracle, and that's the historical Jesus. And I'm seeing a lot of these methodologies that, to me, doesn't make they don't make sense. So what is your take on that?
I think it was Albert Schweitzer who first made that critique, decades ago into the 20th century, that we look for the historical Jesus and basically find him looking in the mirror for us. So maybe today Jesus becomes a social justice warrior for certain moral rights that our culture is focused on. I think you're right. I think this is a fair observation. All I can do is ask myself if I'm doing the same thing. Am I just reading scholars that agree with me? Am I reading my biases into the text? And am I willing to be challenged with my understanding to see things differently? So I've got a book right here that's like misreading scripture with individualist eyes. It's all about bringing kind of a Western mindset to scripture. I've got a few books that talk about that. So I think you're right in terms of observing scholarship as a whole. And we need to challenge ourselves by reading people that have a different background and maybe have a different bias than we have. And we also just have to make sure we have integrity in our own research. I think Mike Licona did this in The Resurrection. I mean, he laid out criteria. He laid his biases out very clearly and then assessed things and put his research out for the public. I think that's the best we can do to minimize the concern that you're raising.
So do you think this is just kind of built on that same idea? I notice in the Bible that they never describe how Jesus looks. And I noticed that they really don't describe how very many people look. There was one guy who was short, and that's about what we get. And so and so we see all these pictures of Jesus. Sometimes, like you said, in a Western view, sometimes they make Jesus white. And we say, well, wait a second, he was in the ancient Near East, and maybe he's more likely to be darker skinned and that sort of thing. But my question to you is, do you think Jesus ever smiled?
Oh my goodness. One of the things I love about the show, The Chosen, the TV show, is they really show this human side of Jesus. It's not just scripted based on Luke, as important as those kind of books are. They show him talking and playing with children. I absolutely think that he did. I think I have another book right here. Interestingly enough, it just happens to be sitting here. What's So Funny About God? And it's all about God's sense of humor. God clearly has a sense of humor. I mean, he made duck-billed platypuses. I mean, like, honestly, God has a sense of humor, and so did Jesus. So the scriptural writers are asking different questions and writing in a different fashion than we do today. That's why, even in pictures, we're like, smile, we have these assumptions. Back then, nobody had that assumption. But I think when we look at the character of God, we look at Jesus' heart for kids, we look that he made us with a sense of humor in scripture. Even there's like some proverbs that talk about it's good for your health to have joy. I think Jesus found a way to have joy in his life unquestionably.
Sean, or Dr. Sean.
Sean is great.
Okay, Sean. Christians have used this argument when it comes to the resurrection. They say, hey, the reason why we know this is true is because, again, the martyrdom question. They wouldn't die for something that they didn't know it was true or something to that effect. Do you think that the martyrdom question proves or helps the resurrection question, so to speak?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked this. I try, unless it's just a slip, to not use word prove for something historical.
That's just,
and I know you do too. I was interviewing Gary Habermas. I'm like, does this prove it? And he's like, we don't use proof. I'm like, I just made that mistake with Gary Habermas. I knew that. So in history, we're talking about probability and the strength of the evidence, kind of abductive reasoning. All this proves when it's said and done. Again, I just use the word proves. All this shows when it's said and done is that the apostles are not liars. They didn't make this story up. They really believed they had seen the risen Jesus and were willing to suffer and die for that belief. Now, some might come along and go, yeah, it was hallucinations. Okay, their willingness to die doesn't disprove hallucinations. It doesn't disprove all these naturalistic hypotheses. So I would just say it's one piece of a larger argument for the resurrection that involves other components as well, basically tied to their sincerity, which is a larger part of their trustworthiness as those who testify to having seen the risen Jesus.
But the martyrdom question could be true and the resurrection be false, and vice versa. I mean, you don't need. I don't think you even need the martyrdom question to be true for the resurrection to be true.
Okay. Yes, there's not a strict logical necessity that it's like A or non-A. So, yes, it could be that they all died natural deaths and the resurrection happened. Now, that would raise an issue for Peter because of John 20 and James because of Acts 12. But nevertheless, that could happen. We don't need their martyrdoms to establish the resurrection. And it's possible they all died as martyrs, were mistaken, and the resurrection didn't happen. So those are possibilities we have to concede. The question is, what is the most probable explanation for their willingness to suffer, no recantation we're aware of, and the fact that some of them died as a martyr? I think the best explanation is they really believe they'd seen the risen Jesus.
Yeah, that explanation explains the evidence better. It's just sometimes certain arguments, it's kind of like when I saw this debate of anti-right with
Dominic Crossan.
Dominic Crossan, yeah.
Yes. William Lane Craig was saying, "Oh, I didn't like that. He didn't use the anti-tomb argument." And yeah, even in his books, it doesn't mean that he doesn't believe that the empty tomb didn't happen or anything.
Sure.
But it's just that he doesn't want to open a Pandora box of things that then people can say, "Oh yeah, but you couldn't prove this, therefore the whole thing is false." That is my only worry with this, because again, even if I were to grant, hey, have it your way, none of them died of martyrdom, I can actually show that Jesus rose from the dead, or that's the most likely explanation.
Sure.
So I've got a question here from Spartan Theology, and I don't know if I haven't read this book, so I don't know if you have, but he says, what does he think about Douglas Campbell's book, Framing Paul? In it, he shows that if we use Acts as historical, it contradicts Paul's letters. Have you read that book?
So I haven't read that book, but probably 6 or 8 months ago, I had Craig Keener on to talk about when his smaller commentary on Acts came out. And he walks through in the intro and makes a case that there's not really a contradiction. Now, he does show that there's a few passages that are in tension, and those ones need explanation. But as I read through that, I thought, you know what? There's a big difference between saying they contradict and they're explained to a different audience in a different way. I think there's plausible ways to reconcile these based on Keener looking at them one by one. So that's the best I can do. I haven't read the book, but the intro in Keener's book goes into detail if you're at least looking for a critique of that idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I don't know why, but some people have trouble with the idea of differences. And to me, that history is messy. So it's not like reading some beautiful novel that everything coincides and looks
right
and pretty. You are, because it's history that we're dealing with, you are going to have discrepancies. And I'm okay with discrepancies, which is not the same thing as contradictions.
I agree. I think that's well said.
Do you think there are any contradictions in there that we can't reconcile our way out of? And I say that's one of the arguments against apologetics from some atheists. They say, oh, well, I'm going to tell you about the story of when Judas hung himself versus when he fell headlong. And I'm going to say that can no way be reconciled. And I can think of at least 2 ways to reconcile that. But then they say that's what apologists do. You just try to make up these things. And so what do you think? Do you think there are any provable contradictions?
No, I think there's some passages that are tougher than others to try to explain away, but I don't think there's any direct contradictions that I'm aware of. Keep in mind what a contradiction is. It's when you affirm and deny the exact opposite. It's raining and it's not raining at the same time in the same place. So one reports one angel, another reports 2. That's not a contradiction. That's a difference. Mm-hmm. If Matthew said he went out and hung himself and Acts said he didn't hang himself, that's a contradiction. But there's not a contradiction between hanging and one falling. All you have to do to remove the charge of contradiction is show a possible way that they can be reconciled. Because if something truly reconciles, there's not a contradiction. Now, are there some tough passages? Yeah, of course there are. We're dealing with multiple books, different genres, written at different times, different audiences. We'd expect that. But I don't think it's mental gymnastics. I think this is what responsible historians should do, as long as we don't just make up these completely just bizarre ideas to reconcile them.
That's, I think that's a really good point, because like it says, it never said there was only one angel, or he did not hang himself or anything like that. And so I can see your point. I think that's good. I probably have time for one more question. I know my assistant set this up. I don't know if the expectation was we were going longer. If so, I am so sorry. Oh, no. This is fine.
Yeah.
So Joel, do you have a question you want to?
Oh no, I'm good. I don't know if you want to take an extra question from the audience, and we can just leave it at this.
Or maybe what we should do is we'll let Sean. Can you tell us, Sean, about what you're working on and what people can look for now? I know you've got a channel with a celebratory 50,000 subscribers. So if you guys haven't done it yet, go be 50,001. So what are you working on? What's on your plate?
Well, a handful of things. I just turned in a lot of my grades, which was nice yesterday, kind of take a breath of fresh air. But this summer, I'm actually working on the YouTube channel. I've got an intern who's helping me a ton. We have some interviews lined up that I'm blown away at. Like Carl Trueman is coming on to talk about Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, one of the best books I've read in a year. Got J.P. Moreland and William Lane Craig coming back. So doing that. Got a ton of speaking this summer. I finished up an update to my first book, which was called Ethics Being Bold in a Whatever World. Working through edits with that right now. It won't come out till like spring 2022, but that's a student book that I have an awesome name for. I don't know if I can release it yet, but pretty excited about that because all this cancel culture and divisive culture. I had a student ask me this week, he's like, what profession can I pick where I might not lose my job? And I thought, wow, there's young people really wrestling with these ideas because of their faith. We need to build some Daniel-like courage and wisdom into them.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm working on.
We hope to bring it back anytime soon to talk about cancel culture and all of that stuff. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on. I hope you guys please like and subscribe and make sure you go over to Sean McDowell's channel, Dr. Sean McDowell's channel. He is an expert in a lot of different topics, and you just heard a little teeny smidgen of his vast knowledge on this sort of thing. So you have to also read, if you haven't yet, read the book, The Fate of the Apostles, and pick up Evidence That Demands a Verdict, Life-Changing Truth for a Skeptical World. Pick that up too, because that's a very thick and very detailed volume that will blow you away, and you'll realize, I can't deny Christianity. It's true. So thank you so much. So I'm going to go ahead and shut it off here.